how do you make a lot of money in a tightening market and make the best deal you can make when you're having to go pay retail? I said, well, guys, you can go pay any price for a piece of property. Price doesn't matter. And of course, their jaw kind of dropped and they looked at me and they said, what the heck? And I said, no, price doesn't matter. It's how you pay them back.
Welcome to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association, providing benefits and services to real estate investors and rental property owners for over 48 years. With your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group.
This episode is sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com. Hello and welcome to episode 256. Anyone who has spent some time in the performing and non-performing note world is going to be familiar with today's guest. Over the past 40 years, he has purchased more than 40,000 notes, and his NoteSchool executive team has bought $3.5 billion in notes. He's an esteemed teacher of all aspects of real estate notes. He's won many industry awards, and he's an inaugural inductee into the Small Balance Real Estate Hall of Fame. Of course, I'm talking about Eddie Speed, and I'm excited to finally have the opportunity to talk with him. Over the past decade, he has helped countless investors expand their portfolios by the millions using his out-of-the-box techniques. And today, he's going to share a new strategy that he's teaching and using himself to make huge profits. Eddie, welcome to the show.
How are you, Brian? Thank you very much.
I'm doing great, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. I want to start just by having our audience find out a little bit more about you. Can you fill them in on who you are?
Sure, that'd be great. So I really started in the business in 1980. I started with my father-in-law and a partner, and of course, they were in the seller finance note buying business. So seller financing was very active in the early 80s because of high interest rates. And seller financing has always sort of filled a gap when, like the markets had a void, and then seller financing, if somebody would find a scenario where that they can really fill the void. So I did that, started out with him, moved to Dallas-Fort Worth. My wife and I married in 1982. And really, I moved there to have an office for them initially, and subsequently have been here ever since. And, a lot of my career, I tell people I've closed 40,000 notes, but the truth of the matter is I've closed probably well over 50,000. So it's at some point, what does it matter? I sort of quit counting. And, but a lot of the volume that I did over the years was helping real estate investors with their note strategies. Because once again, if I can help a real estate investor with how he could do creative financing and how the seller even carries seller financing for them, there becomes opportunities for me to become involved in that. So I've been involved in a number of high volume real estate masterminds. These are the kind of the 100 house a year, plus masterminds. And I've been going to these things for probably 10 years. About 2 years ago, I'm sitting there listening to these guys, and they all were sort of saying the same thing. Competition, right? They've really perfected marketing. They've really perfected buying houses. But the problem is their conversions were dropping because the seller kept demanding a higher, closer cost to retail. Well, how do you do that? How do you make a lot of money in a tightening market and make the best deal you can make when you're having to go pay retail, right? So this is what led me to it, and just sitting down with them, after a mastermind one evening, I said, well, guys, you can go pay any price for a piece of property. Price doesn't matter. And of course, their jaw kind of dropped and they looked at me and they said, what the heck, right? And I said, no, price doesn't matter. It's how you pay them back. And of course, I've been teaching students and I've been investing in real estate myself using terms pricing. Well, the first house my wife and I bought in 1983 was on terms, right? Interest rates were still super high and we were self-employed. We couldn't, and so the only way we could buy is get the seller to carry the terms and conditions of the loan that a bank or a mortgage company would never agree to. Well, that was in 1983, right? That's a long time ago. And I bought ranches and commercial property and houses and all kinds of different properties where I got the seller to agree to essentially terms of the loan that a commercial or lender or a bank would never have agreed to. But here's what I figured out. I probably have seen 400,000 seller finance notes in my career, right? 40 years, closed 50,000 transactions. Surely I've seen, almost 10 times that many, and just people that had notes that we didn't necessarily buy, right? And what I figured out was people would consistently show up at my doorstep and bring their seller finance transaction. And you and I are looking at it thinking, whoa, you didn't charge any interest. Or you waived the interest for the first 5 years. Or, whoa, you didn't even get a payment for the first 5 years. Or you agreed to just one lump sum of money due 10 years from now. Or on and on and on. And so when I would start quizzing these people about why you would agree to something so crazy, their answer was, I got my price. And what it made me start understanding from a psychology standpoint, people will give the farm away if they get their price. And so the whole premise of this direction is that you're not worried about trying to buy it at a discount. You're buying on discount terms, not discount price.
Let's go back to the mastermind group that you're in. When you shared those thoughts with them, were you also able to help them put that into action? Because it's one thing to say it and understand it, but it's another thing to actually do it.
It was like, there was a couple of things I did. In fact, there's probably 4 of the biggest real estate mastermind groups out there. And I've done fairly excessive teaching for 3 of them, right? And meaning that I've done like one-day events, I've invited them to, special classes and even put them into our regular. So probably have had, of the top 500 house buyers in the business, at least 250 of them have been to NoteSchool in the last 18 months, right? And the thing is we have a big idea that we've learned, and that is, listen, I've got 40 years experience. I wake up thinking about this every day. So we can do some fairly complex deal modeling, right? Financial modeling. But I don't expect people to start out there. I just show them some simple stuff and say, go do this. Go get somebody to agree to this. And I would give them examples and case studies. And all of a sudden, then as you can see, like they couldn't go do everything I could do, but they could go do something. Right. And they would consistently reach back and say, man, I closed the deal on terms that I'd thrown in the garbage. There was no way we were going to deal together. And I'm like, see, it works. Just got to try it.
Can you start us off with an example of what you're talking about?
So I use a case study. This is a young man that was in Seattle. And of course, Seattle's cooled off now and so forth, but it was on fire, right? It was just the hottest real estate market in the country. And he was getting married. And he said, I want to buy a property and I don't want to put a lot of money down. And I don't want to live in a concrete parking lot, right? I want us to own a house. So he did a campaign of people that own their properties free and clear. And he found somebody that was willing to carry terms for him. They were willing to carry owner financing for him. And of course, typical thing about owner financing is there's no personal guarantee. There's no corporate guarantee. They don't ask for all that stuff. They wouldn't think to ask for it. So I always tell people, if you can go buy property with seller financing on terms, you can have a $50 million line of credit, just one little deal at a time. No personal guarantee, no qualifications. Which, by the way, if you're old like me, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. And so because markets, you can work a long time and go backwards and having a situation that you can sleep at night knowing that you haven't signed your life away every time you sign a set of loan docs can be kind of a thing, right? So bottom line is they were willing to carry financing. He was only paying like literally $5,000 down on $325,000 house. But the seller was insistent on 5% interest. Oh, we'll owner finance you, but we want 5% interest, right? Well, this was a duplex. He was going to live in one side and rent the other. And he decided he wanted the rental side, his debt service to the people seller financing him. He wanted the rental side to pay his mortgage payment. He was willing to pay taxes and insurance, but he wanted the rent side to pay his mortgage, and he was off. He was off by about, I don't know, $300 or $400. And they had gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. We're talking 10 interactions. So he brings it to me. He's a coaching student. He brings it on what we call our deal lab. And he says, Eddie, I think we're stuck. I just want to make sure we're stuck. And he went through the whole story and told it. He was frustrated. They were frustrated because they liked each other, but they were not going to finance less than 5% interest. So we backed into what a 5% mortgage could debt service on one side of the duplex, right? We just backed into the number, and that was like $260,000. Well, he's paying $325, and he only they've agreed he can only pay. They're okay with him only paying $5,000 down. He's $60,000 apart. And I said, well, that solves your problem there, you know. And I, knowing him well, I was sort of teasing him. Like I wasn't telling the rest of the story. I said, okay, well, that solves your problem. That's what you do. Just get them to finance $260. And he's like, whoa, stop. They're stuck on the price, and they're not going to take a dime less. I said, okay, we'll write them an error note. Now, me being from Texas and him being from Seattle, I had to spell it. AIR, an error note. You know, I can make it multi-syllable, right? And he goes, what do you mean? He's got to coach with me a long time. I said, an error note. Write him a $60,000 note, 0 interest, 0 payments due in 15 years. I said, I guarantee you they'll take it. He called me back and he says, you're not going to believe it. They never stuttered. I said, of course they didn't. They got their price. I said, I know people will agree to crazy stuff. I totally got that. If I have any vantage point of anybody in America, I've looked at 400,000 seller finance notes. Who's ever seen that? Right? I know what people are willing. I know what's in their head. I know what they're willing to agree to. And so that's a quick example of how just a sliver of ridiculous financing fixed a gigantic real estate deal.
Did your students strike 2 notes, one that had 0 interest and then the other one had 5% interest?
Yeah.
And the two of them added up to the purchase price.
Exactly. So we did a first lien for $260 at 5% interest. Debt service was like $1,500 a month. And then they did a second note that was $60,000, 0 payments, 0 interest, just one lump sum due like 15 years in the future.
I want to dwell on that just for a moment because I think that's brilliant. So you put a number on, you helped your student put a number on the difference between what the mortgage was that he could pay and the actual ability of his to pay based on the income coming from the second unit.
Yeah.
And that number turned out to be $60,000.
Yeah, they're hung up on a price.
Right. Okay. So they still got their full price. They still got their 5% interest, but it was on the portion that your student was actually able to pay.
Yeah. And so that's what he kept kind of arguing, you know, bantering with me and saying, well, Eddie, they are insisting on 5% interest. I said, they are getting 5% interest. You only need a reprieve on interest of a little bit of the deal. You see, everybody else, all the engineers said, well, just lower the interest rate. Well, let me just tell you something. Everybody can think of that. The problem is they weren't going to do it. I try to come up with solutions. It's like the customer's willing to agree to what I'm proposing. Everybody can think of something that's impossible, and then you're at an impasse. Well, he was already at an impasse. They weren't going to lower the interest rate on their first mortgage.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about Green Property Management. Not only do they manage everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area, they also manage my entire portfolio. So I can tell you from personal experience that their unique flat fee management style is worth a closer look. If you feel that your property isn't operating to its fullest potential, then Green Property Management can help you take a holistic approach that will save you money, eliminate your headaches, and increase your net income. And if you're a property manager interested in applying Green Property Management's model, give them a call at 1-866-95-GREEN or visit them on the web at greenpropertymgt.com. I think it's really interesting that you understand the seller psychology so well that you were able to just come up with this what did you call it? An air loan?
An air note. It's
An
just
air
money
note.
out in the future. It's in the air.
And is that your term, or is that a real?
I just made it up.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna use it from now on. So you created an air note. Let's talk about that seller psychology, because you've made it clear that they just want to get their price.
Yeah.
And they'll bend over backwards and give you any sort of terms quite often to get that price. What are some of your other insights into seller psychology? What else are they looking for? And did your student need to present that in a certain way in order to get them to buy into it?
The talk off is half the deal. There's no doubt about it. And that's one of the big emphasis that obviously we do in NoteSchool is talk about the talk off. And so, I had seen there's about 5%. I've kind of seen this number. It's about 5% of real estate investors that regularly make what I call terms offers. They regularly would say, hey, if you'll carry the financing, I'll come closer to your price. And usually when they do that, they all kind of like have one or two structures, and they paint that structure over every deal. We've all heard it, right? 0% interest, 10-year note, right? Or something like that, right? But the answer is just looking at it from a different perspective, because these people would show up at my doorstep. You got to remember, we looked at 400,000 seller finance notes. So people have shown up at our doorstep trying to go sell us the note that somebody that was more sophisticated than them kind of dictated the terms of the note. And I looked at it and thought a lot of times they missed the magic because they were so hung up on this. And I'm like, well, I started figuring out other ways to approach it psychologically where the customer would be okay with it. And we've come up with a number of strategies, but it all goes back to this, right? Just visualize yourself, Brian. You're sitting there at the kitchen table. You're trying to buy a property, right? And now real estate has reached such a price level, you're going to need some creative terms because it just probably won't perfectly debt service otherwise, right? The nice property, not slum stuff, but nice stuff. The cost of the property versus what the financing, debt service is. You got to go get something a little creative, or a lot of times the math won't work. And particularly, we're now entering a market where landlords are getting clobbered with this credit availability thing. You got to remember, 35% of the people that could get a mortgage in February can't get one today, right? And self-employeds are particularly getting butchered. So this is now not, this isn't, I don't think this is an option anymore. I think it's an essential ingredient that you got to have some of this in your toolbox, right? And once again, I like this example because you could have just gotten a regular traditional mortgage for $260,000. The seller could have only carried the second. In this case, they carried the first and the second. But that's not absolutely what could have had to have happened. You could have got a regular traditional first mortgage and got the seller to carry a second. And so I've learned that sellers will agree to things that you think they wouldn't agree to based on the price. So let's talk about that talk off for 1 second. You're at the kitchen table, right? And you want to offer 200 and they want 230. Okay, is that a fair number? You're trying to buy it at 200, 230, and they're just like, and of course they've talked to their brother-in-law and their neighbor sold a house down the street. And there's all these ancillary factors that you can't really compete with, because in the truth of the matter is they're possibly comparing apples to oranges, right? And there's some goofy reason they just haven't called a realtor and sold the property, right? There's something about the deal that's not clear to them, it's totally clear to you, that this is an investor deal. It's not a straight regular, list and sell realtor brokerage deal. So you're saying, okay, well, Ms. Smith, you seem to be stuck on 230, and you're saying there's no way you would consider any less. So let me say this. I can pay the price you're wanting, but you'll have to take your price over time, your equity over time. And as long as you're willing to take your equity over time, I can meet the price that no other investor can meet. Then all of a sudden, guess what starts happening? They're saying, tell me how that works. What am I focusing on? I'm focusing on solving the one problem that nobody else has solved. So I've learned this just by interviewing all these people that were willing to sell or finance and sort of get to the psychology of what's in their head. By the way, I'll tell you an interesting fact. We've dropped probably 5 million pieces of mail that people that own a seller finance note. Okay. 1 in 500 people, mom and pops. This is not a real estate investor. It's not a guy that carries 100 seller finance notes. This is just a mom and pop, right? The owner financed the property. 1 in 500 will have a credit report or a loan application. They won't even have the level of information you would require to rent a house to them. And they've sold it.
What would you recommend if you're selling a property, if someone's listening to this and is selling a property on terms, what should they expect from that buyer? Like, what should they do to protect themselves?
Perfect. Right now, 35% of the people that could get a mortgage in February can't get one today. There's no shortage of penalty box buyers, right? A just missed buyer today is a guy that was perfectly qualified to get a Fannie Mae loan in January. He just can't get one today. I mean, you should see an average of 15 to 20% down, because the traditional mortgage industry today, the average down payment last month, according to Ellie Mae, was 16% down. That's the average. So thinking you're going to sell to somebody with problems, injured credit and weak down payment, and let's just be fair about it, kind of a sad story. I don't need to sell to him, right? I'm going to sell a good property to a good buyer and owner finance them because the market says I'm filling a void conventional lending isn't filling. Conventional lending has a significant issue right now, right? We have the most diverse situation in real estate in my 40 years I've ever seen. On one hand, the market is on fire. You can sell anything for any price right now, and people are tearing it off the shelves. They're buying it like toilet paper in March, right? Or in April. But on the other hand, the mortgage industry has already significantly tightened up its underwriting. I mean, and it's written in every mortgage banking journal every week, right? I mean, there is all kind of talk, all kind of conversation about where the market's going and, underwriting and how they're tightening up and that kind of thing. So from your audience, they're like, oh my God, is this the time to stop? No, it's a time to see an opportunity. It's a time to look at it through a different set of lens and say, this is that situation where if we're surprised by it, we're probably going to get clobbered by it. If we're aware of it and we see other strategies that relate to what we've been doing, but maybe not exactly what we've been doing, I see it as a bonanza.
Let's say you're a buyer and you have a seller that is willing to sell on terms. Does that always mean that you should buy that deal on terms? Because I see a lot of people trying to figure it out, just like your original example, and still not being able to pencil out.
Well, let me just tell you this. You can't make me overpay. I got 40 years experience and I'm fairly decent at working a whiteboard. And I promise you, I can come up with terms that sound, you would think I need to be in a straitjacket and I'm smiling, right? So that's experience. And that's why we teach what we teach, right? The best way to teach people these ideas is simply case studies. Like you and I did not even discuss this before the call, right? You and I did not discuss this, but I'm willing to probably bet you $100 that you're like, I want to come to NoteSchool and see some of this. Am I right?
I would love to see more of these case studies. Can you share,
well, that's what I'm saying.
One or two of them with us?
But once again, the point is people don't know what they don't know. People haven't seen what they haven't seen. And there is obviously a reason that 250 or 300 of the biggest house buyers out there, they've all talked to each other and they said, man, that Eddie Speed's NoteSchool stuff, it's just kind of crazy what they come up with. But I can see how it works. And so once again, why does it work? Well, let's go back to the very concept of any entrepreneur. What does an entrepreneur do? He solves a problem other people can't solve. So I'm sitting there watching real estate investors throwing 19 deals in the garbage can and closing one. Their ratio is 19 to 1, right? That's about average of the big guys in the business. So they're buying one deal, they're throwing 19 in the garbage can, and I'm like, does that not just drive you crazy? And they're like, yeah, it drives us crazy, but there's nothing we can do about it. And I'm like, oh, yeah. I said, you just need to raise your price. And they're like, ha, 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 ha. Raise our price? If we raised our price, Eddie, it wouldn't make sense for us. And I said, oh, no, you just structure it where it makes sense for you. You just disregard the ceiling of price is only in your head. And then all of a sudden you start showing them how they actually could do it. And they're like, they feel like they're the most free person that's ever been.
I'd love to hear another crazy example. One of the ones that everyone said, there's no way, Eddie, you're crazy to think that's going to work, but yet it did work.
So I have another case study that we love doing. This is from a high volume real estate investor. This young man named is Scott Bowers. He lives in Phoenix. So he's been in Collective Genius. He's been in Billionaire Boardroom. He's been in these high volume masterminds. Nice young man. And he has a house bought on terms. And he's even got the guy to agree to a discounted a little bit. So the guy's selling it slightly below retail. And then he's also got it on terms, but the old man is stuck on interest rate, right? And he's stuck on a 10-year balloon. So he's an older fella and he's wanting a 10-year balloon. Well, let me ask you something. When people tell me they're stuck on a 10-year balloon, they have no idea what they did with the money in 10 years. They just picked a number in their head, 8-year balloon, 10-year balloon. They don't know what they do with the money. They just think that's as long as I'm willing to finance it. So what have I learned? Offer them more interest. Well, wait a minute. If you're offering them more interest and you say below market terms, below interest rate, below qualification standards, why in the world are you willing to raise the interest rate? So he brings the deal to us and it's at 5% interest. Okay. 30-year amortization, 10-year balloon. And it's a good deal. I said, Scott, we can make this deal better. He goes, yeah, but Eddie, don't mess with it. It's close enough. I said, okay, well, I said, do you mind if we play with it? So we throwed it up on the whiteboard and we penciled it out. So I got him to propose carrying the interest on the loan at 2% interest for the first 5 years, and then carrying it at 6.5% interest for now not another 5 years, but for another 10 years. So now we're pushing the balloon out from 10 years to 15 years. Now, on the surface, you would say, well, that doesn't balance. But you got to remember, on 2% interest, I'm sawing off the amortization of the principal that's owed. So, of course, I'm paying 6.5% interest, but I'm paying it on way less principal.
When you say carry the interest, what exactly does that mean?
The seller's willing to own or finance, but he wanted 5% interest, and he wanted a 10-year balloon, and he was stuck. That's it. That's all I'm going to do. I mean, my guys bantered back. They don't bring it to me the first little time the first little objection. They think they've beat it up a little bit. I mean, they think they've gone down the road with it, and so I just have to show them how to reposition it. So the idea is the lower interest rate escalated to a higher interest rate. The higher interest rate gets them in a mode to carry the financing longer than they would have originally agreed to it. And you're thinking, yeah, but you're paying higher interest. Yes, but because of the artificially low interest on the front end, I have cut down the principal that's owed. So when you get to the higher interest rate, it's on an inordinately lower amount of principal owed than normal, right? In other words, theoretically, at the end of 5 years, you would owe on a $100,000 debt, you'd owe like $92,000. But the way the math works on the lower interest rate, you owe interest on $80,000. You see what I'm saying? So there's another way to kind of disguise the bargain by getting them to agree to something. And I've learned this. They'll take the higher interest rate. They'll hear the higher interest rate on the backside, and they'll kind of disregard the lower interest rate on the front side. I don't know. I just figured it out. I just, anytime you try something 10,000 times, sometimes you figure out some pattern to it, right?
So I want to make sure I'm clear and our listeners are clear. It's what I'm hearing you say is that the first 5 years, the interest rate was actually lower than the 5% that the seller wanted.
2%.
And then after 5 years, it goes up to even higher than what the seller wanted.
That's right.
Gotcha. Okay. So when you say carry the interest rate, it's going to start off at what'd you say, 2%?
2%.
Did you have it set up so it escalated each year, or it just reached that 5-year point and then clicked over to 6%?
Yeah. And we've structured a lot of deals like that. So the starter rate will be 0 to 2%, right? That's just kind of an average, right? And then for the adjustment term, it'll usually be 5 to 8 years. So the first 5 to 8 years, they're carrying it, let's just say at ridiculous terms. And then the seller says, okay, well, I need all my money. And they say, well, what if I paid, what could you put your money into to earn more interest than this? And they're like, well, wait a minute. You'd pay me 5 or 6% interest? And they're like, yeah, I do that. And so all of a sudden, then I've learned that I can almost every time, there's no 100% to anything, right? But almost 100% of the time, I can get them to go from what they thought was going to be insistent on an 8-year balloon or a 10-year balloon to push that out to 10 or even 20 years. And I've done it so many case studies now. I'm like, I just know it'll work. Now, the one thing is, Brian, you have to believe it, right? If you're a student and I can't get you to believe that they will say yes to this, you'll never say it in a way they'll say yes to it. So this is why I use case studies. In other words, if I show you enough case studies where customers have agreed to it, then all of a sudden you're like, yep, I can see it. It's real to you. In other words, it's past a theory. It's just looking at experience of other people's situation.
Well, talk about that confidence. I mean, does that confidence of offering a deal like that, does that come from just reviewing case study after case study, doing it 10 times? I mean, how often do your students go out the first time and just fall flat on their face making these types of offers?
If a student goes out one time and falls flat on their face and quits, they should have never started. I mean, I'm a guy that's survived in the business for 40 years. I've closed 50,000 deals and looked at a whole bunch of deals that, I got slapped in the face, right? Somebody didn't want to deal with me. So you got to kind of be tougher than that, right? If you're gonna go survive in this business, you got to play the odds. Let me just tell you something. If I looked at 6 or 7 possible deals that created financing because of the property and because of their existing financing or whatever it was, right? However we were doing it, and I could close 1 out of 6, I would say bonanza. Because I'm looking at real estate investors that are making 20 offers and getting 1 house bought. Well, that statistic sucks, right? That's a 5% success rate. So if I can take another piece of that same inventory that's now in the garbage can, and I can go move some of that to a closed file, then I'm saying that's bonanza. And you're right. You're going to go try it some, and you'll be better at it in a couple of months than you are today. But I will say that giving people confidence in showing them other examples of where people have already done this is one of the best tools that I think we use, because that makes you feel like, hey, you're not the only guy that's ever tried this.
When you do make these offers, there's always going to be some sort of objection or feedback from the seller. What are some of those objections or feedback when you make some of your creative offers, and how do you get around those?
You don't ever find yourself with a seller wanting to have their cake and eat it too, do you?
All the time.
Exactly. So yeah, everybody wants their price, and they want they want this and they want that. So it becomes a matter of what's the most important thing to you, and I can't give you all 3 of the things you want, but I can give you the thing that's most important to you, and you got to make them start picking choices, right? So the one thing about carrying terms is it does allow them to defer taxes. They can do an installment sales process and defer taxes. So that does help them as far as a big argument is, you pay taxes in the future because you're taking the income in the future. And that's that's a legitimate argument. A lot of people will make really dumb decisions otherwise because they don't want to pay taxes. I mean, as long as they can avoid paying taxes, they'll do something else that does, to me, doesn't make quite sense. But they're like, but I beat the IRS, and so, but yeah, it's always a matter of I always think like the entrepreneur negotiating has to understand that you never immediately get to the big yes the very first time you have a conversation with them. If you do, you probably offered too soft of a deal. You walk in and say, hey, I'll pay you this for this piece of property. And the guy goes, heck yeah. He signs immediately. Then what do you think driving home? You're thinking I shouldn't have made that offer, right? You're thinking I should have offered less.
Well, you're always going to second guess yourself.
Yeah. So in that same mindset, understand that I always say a terms offer is a slow man's game, right? It's not, don't expect them to immediately take all of the terms and conditions that are possible in the very first engagement. And so once again, just look at it as kind of a selling cycle. Like the first conversation would be, so Brian, let's talk about any immediate cash needs that you have. I think I can focus on getting you your price, and you sound like that's your most important thing. Is that your most important thing, Brian? And then you're like, yeah, that's my, and I'm like, okay, I can do that. But let's make sure that we understand your immediate cash needs. Now, don't focus cash needs related to price. I'm focused on your price, but I'm going to need you to carry your equity over time in order to be able to give you that price. So let's back into it and determine your immediate cash needs. Now, Brian, when I just did that with you, I didn't ask you how much you wanted down. You see the difference? Because if you ask them how much they want down, they're going to dream up 25% down or something, right? And trust me, I can come up with some really creative ways to come up with financing, and it is not my cash.
Eddie, over the past 40 years, I'm sure you've been in all kinds of negotiations and you've come up with your own negotiation techniques. I'm wondering for our listeners if there's any systems you use like NLP or other types of negotiation or getting along with the investor type techniques, or any books that you would recommend.
Well, if you've never read Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference, you're robbing yourself. That's number one. The other thing is I have long relationship with John Martinez. And John Martinez clearly has trained more real estate investors, psychology at the kitchen table buying houses than anybody else by far. I mean, if you looked at the wholesaling business, the one common thread with 2,000 of the best wholesalers in the business ever is John Martinez. But John Martinez took Chris Voss's strategies. You know who Chris Voss is, right? He was like the number one hostage negotiator in the world.
Yeah, if people haven't read that book, I highly recommend it as well.
Great guy. I was in a private coaching session with him a couple of weeks ago. Pretty crazy, by the way. And so if you notice, though, and all, whether it's John Martinez and how he trains or whether it's Chris Voss, it's like, of course, they've got ridiculous demands. Like people walking into a negotiation thinking that the other side isn't going to have ridiculous demands, that's just kind of foolishness. Of course they're going to want something ridiculous, right? That doesn't mean that's what you eventually have to agree to. You have to find commonality with them, right? And if you listen to the thread that we've been discussing, like through this podcast, I have found commonality with the customer. What's the commonality? I know what their price is, and I know that I'm convincing them that they're hung up on price. Most people are trying to convince them you're not hung up on price, and I'm telling them, no, you're hung up on price. I can tell. And they're like, yeah, I am. Well, the more they do that, the more they're playing by what I want to do, which is I don't really care what the price is. I just care how we structure the terms.
I believe in the law of threes, and you've given us two great examples of creative terms. Do you have a third you could share with us?
I like to use some kind of mortgage financing and get the seller to carry a second. And so if if let's go back to our $200,000 piece of property. And Brian, do you have any immediate cash needs? And you got some existing debt. You got to pay the IRS. You want to send your grandkid to college, blah, blah, blah. And you got $100,000. Let's just say you owned it free and clear or close to, but it took $100,000. And so instead of trying to get you to owner finance the whole thing, I can see that probably isn't going to work. And so I use a hybrid. I'll use private financing. And they'll have the first, and the seller will then carry a second. And I might even split, if you just do the math here with me, $200,000. So $100,000 is going to be a new first mortgage from a private lender or a bank or whatever, right? And then the other $100,000 is going to be seller financing. But of that seller financing, Brian, I might get them to carry part of it where I give, 50,000 of it where I give them a monthly payment and some interest, and 50,000 of it where we do the crazy thing, the air note, right? The zero interest, zero pay. And so once again, I'm giving them all of a little bit of what they thought they wanted. I gave them their immediate cash needs. I gave them a monthly payment. And I gave them the price because I popped that air note on top of it, and it's just $50,000 due way out in the future. And by the way, if you structure these deals correctly, you're going to buy your own note at a discount, virtually 100% of the time.
Wait, explain that. You mean that eventually the seller is going to come back to you and say, hey, you want to buy the note from me?
Of course they are. That's why they show up at my doorstep. They're trying to sell me a note, right? So if the longer the term, the more likely they are to sell you your own note at a discount. And the way you structure the deal, like the paperwork, the terms of the loan, there's a lot of little stuff we're going to put in there, like an excessive amount of stuff we're going to write in there that I know a bank or a mortgage company would never agree to. Like a vacancy clause. If the house goes vacant, it's not making payments, I don't make payments to them. There's a built-in forbearance. Can you do that? Is that legal? Absolutely, it's legal. Would my bank agree to it? Hell no, my bank wouldn't agree to it. That's why you're my bank.
Just to clear it up for our listeners, when we talk about a seller wanting a 7-year note or a 10-year note, that doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna be in that arrangement with them for the next 7 to 10 years.
Yeah, because you're going to buy your own note at a discount.
How long does it usually take before they come to you and say, hey, you want to buy this from me?
Well, here's what really happens. And this is part of a teaching concept that I try to get people to, right? The term that they're paying you, that you're paying them out over time. If you do more than a 10-year term, your odds of buying your own note go up very high. So if you just did a 5-year seller finance notes, just say that there's a 30% odd they would sell you the note at a discount. And you're going to pay them back over 5 years. If you did a 10-year term, the odds are like 50% chance you'll buy your own note at a discount. Do a 12 to 20-year term, your odds go to about 95%. So the longer it takes for them to get their money back, the more likely they are for some event in their life to say, hey, I'll cash in and take my money early. So you buy your own debt, but at a discount. So
when that does happen to you, what do you typically pay to buy that debt back? You paying 80 cents on the dollar, 60 cents?
No, heck no. 60 cents on the dollar, 50 cents on the dollar. I got a case study. I know this sounds nuts, but it's true. I got a case study of a young man. He's one of these ninja house buyers, right? I kept telling him to bake all this into your agreement every time. Bake it into your agreement. He pays a guy for like 8 months. He's very clear that the guy now has woke up and decided he wants the money early. So he basically sort of ghosted him a little bit. He's paying him, but he's not really responding to his texts and other things. So he finally goes along after like 9 months. He owes him $98,000. He settled with him for $15,000. True story. Happened this year.
So the person who sold him the property and created the note was trying to get a hold of him to sell him back the note so that he could raise some cash.
Yeah. And he, and once again, that happens so quick and such at a deep discount. That's clearly not normal. But I would say that, the deal after the deal is buying the debt back from your seller finance lender at a discount. The guy seller financed it. And there's a number of different strategies that we can show people of how to kind of warm people up into that idea. So you don't have to be just stark 6 months after the deal. Okay, I'm going to buy you 50 cents on the dollar. It's not quite like that.
So Eddie, I know you teach this. You mentioned the course or the school that you have. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that and how they would get a hold of you if they wanted to follow up?
We wrote a really good book that is, post-COVID. So we had a book, but we stopped and rewrote the book. It's an ebook. It's about 50 or 60 pages. It's a good read. It really is. I mean, there's nobody too seasoned that wouldn't get something from it. And there's no beginner that wouldn't get some real insight from it. So it's 50 or 60 pages. And I wrote the book in the concept of the movie Moneyball, right? The old Billy Bean story about, the baseball, Oakland A's baseball team. And how, that's, if you've seen that movie, it makes sense. So I wrote it in that concept about you can just look into real estate through another set of lens. So anyway, it's making money with real estate is the concept, but making money with real estate because of how you structure the financing. So I called it a whole new ball game with creative financing, right? So it's an ebook, and then we have a little mini course that we'll put the same people that get the book, we'll put them through that course. So same thing, we like case studies, we like building ideas with people similar to what we've done today, because it makes sense once you have enough time to kind of unpack the story. And then once from there, they can just decide, whatever level that NoteSchool makes sense for them. We've got stuff that's from, virtual classes to taking people to the moon if they want to go,
Eddie, as we wrap it up here, do you have any additional thoughts or advice for our listeners?
I would hope if you've invested the time to listen to this, that your mind is racing right now as to deals you've left on the table. Because sometimes the best deals, the ones we wanted the most, are the ones that we couldn't close because it was such a good property, or it had such good numbers, or it's in such good shape, or all the good things you love about a property. But sometimes that's the very ones that are the toughest to buy. And just think with this strategy that it may free you up to go buy those properties and the very ones you want.
Any follow-up from your mastermind group where these, some of the nation's top house buyers and house flippers are only getting 1 out of 20 of their offers accepted? Any follow-up after using your techniques? Like, what have they improved on those stats?
Listen, I've got excessive amount of case studies of guys that have just drastically changed their net worth on deals that they had thrown in the garbage. I mean, drastic is in drastic. And once again, I mean, you can buy a better grade of property. This is what I've noticed. You can buy a better grade of property and a better grade neighborhood and a better grade thing if price becomes not your wall. Right? Usually the best properties that you want to go chase, the problem is the price. And when you run your math and you're trying to figure out how you're going to exit back out of this thing, you're just like, man, I love that property, but I can't pay that much. And with this, it just gives you the freedom to do that because you're not having to make regular interest to a regular lender and a regular payment, right? You can just, if you can eliminate that, you can make it work.
Fantastic. Well, Eddie, this has been a great masterclass on negotiation, creative real estate note type terms, and just understanding investor and seller psychology. So I want to thank you for taking the time to share this with our listeners. This has been really fascinating.
Thank you. So let me tell them how to find the link.
Oh, yeah, please.
Let's go to noteschool.com/get started, right? Just get started. And there's just a registration page. We're gonna send you the ebook, and we'll get you registered for a little workshop masterclass that will be where we can go on there, and it'll be live, by the way, and we'll be able to go on there and like show you examples and stuff. And some of my team will, slow it down, people seeing examples, it makes a lot of difference. So that's a good way to get started. And I would be very excited to hear back, Brian, even from you, right? Let me know what you think. I mean, because I think this thought process frees us up to see a different piece of our business that I feel like people are leaving on the table and they're not doing.
I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. I'm your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group, and you can find out more about me by going to higinvestor.com. That's higinvestor.com. And you can also ask questions and join us on Facebook by going to RPOA, Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast. This episode was sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com.
You've been listening to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association. You can find out more at rpoaonline.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and review.